Hello, I'm Jess McHugh of Broad Recognition, and I'm here talking to Joseph Fischel, who is a new professor in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies Department. So welcome, Professor Fischel.
Hi, morning.
So how have things been going so far? Can you tell me a little bit about the courses you're going to be teaching throughout this year?
Sure. So right now I'm teaching Introduction to LGBT Studies, and a class titled Theories and Politics of Sexual Consent, Theory and Politics of Sexual Consent, and they're great. The Intro-LGBT Studies is a combination of the various staple texts you would see in most gender sexuality studies courses, plus texts that I think are compelling for the contemporary moment and that I'm interested in. And that I think students are interested in, and that's been going very well. And then Theories and Politics of Sexual Consent looks at consent, a broader political theoretic perspective on consent, some good feminist and legal theory on consent, and then applies them to various controversial phenomena that hopefully illuminate, consent in its various dimensions.
Right.
And in the spring I'm teaching a class called Sexuality and Social Justice that also looks at dominant, mostly liberal philosophies of social justice and asks how can they inform our thinking about sexuality, and how can current thinking about sexuality inform theories of social justice.
Great.
Yeah.
As you kind of discussed a little bit, your research and academic interests are centered around the intersection of politics, law, and sexuality. What first interested you about this field of study, and in what specific instances do you study this kind of interplay?
Okay, so I have had two competing or parallel interests for a long time. When I got to college, I thought that knowledge could save the world and make everything better, and I wanted to, so I became very interested in social justice and theory of social justice, and my plan was to be the new Karl Marx, and that I don't know if that's been successful so far, but so that was one end of things, and then I discovered that people have thought about gender and sexuality, that it's not just the thing you inhabit or the thing you do, on a Saturday night. So that was awesome, and I got really inspired by gender and sexuality scholars. So the point of convergence was thinking about political theory, and I also ended up pretty attracted to law, so thinking about political theory and the role of law and scholarship and issues in gender and sexuality, and so that's all triangulated onto thinking primarily, I think, about the legal regulation of sexuality and sex offenders and youth sexuality and consent, mainly in U.S. law and media.
Nice.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So you went to graduate school for political science, that's right?
Yes.
And what did you end up writing your dissertation on?
So I'm on all of that. I was in political science at the University of Chicago, and my dissertation is titled "Sex and Harm in the Age of Consent," and hopefully it'll be a book someday in the next year or so.
Cool.
And so it focuses on law and media portrayals, contemporary law and media portrayals of sex offenders, youth, and consent.
Right.
And a quick final thought, how I got to all of that was, it seemed when I first started this research that sex offenders were in some ways the new queers, the new sexual marginalized subjects, and so I found that really compelling, but of course it turns out that's not the whole story, because gay people as a class don't harm people, and some sex offenders do, and so there needed to be a much more nuanced approach to thinking about questions of sex offense and youth and vulnerability than just sort of saying, they're the new outside. So that's what compelled me to read all of this.
And what is your research focusing on right now?
It's continuing onward. So I am trying to develop a dissertation into a book.
Right.
And I've lately been researching a particular unraveling or unfolding of these sets of problems in New Orleans.
Nice.
So I've been doing research there, and plan to continue doing research there. There was this wildly anomalous law where soliciting oral or anal sex for money made you a sex offender. So Louisiana had several hundred women on their sex offender registry, which was different than any other state. Like every other state's mostly like 99% men, and then they have hundreds of women, and so who were either sex workers or convicted of sex work, and so that became a fascinating story or thing to think about. So I'm still processing it, different angles to approach those types of questions.
Cool. So I read an essay that you wrote on sex workers
On the
in
Feminist
Louisiana.
Wire.
Yes.
Oh, I remember. Okay, yeah.
Yep. And in it, you asked the question, why are some bodies in sex acts scrutinized or moralized against more than others? So I wanted to kind of pose the same question to you.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't answer the question. I just asked it.
It needs to be put out there. So.
Well, I mean, you can, my thoughts. Some of my initial thoughts are on that, on the Feminist Wire, and on New Orleans. But the question was, a big part of the legal and political campaign to say, look, these women who are either sex workers or convicted of sex work, this is survival sex. They're not harming people. They shouldn't be on the sex offender registry. And the problem of the argument is that it assumes everyone else should, and that sex offender registries are going to help or are going to reduce sexual violence, or that they're performing some sort of good function for the community. And if it turns out they're not, then the question is, why are these bodies being scrutinized in this way more than others?
It seems like the registries haven't really been doing what they were designed to do.
No. One has to answer this in a sort of nuanced, rather boring, empirical way. But for the most part, no. There really is very little evidence that sex offender registries or notification systems in their current form, their current dominant form, help either reducing sexual violence or in terms of lowering recidivism rates of the offenders, like that. So.
Yeah, it would seem to me that kind of sex registries and this law concerning anal and oral sex assumes that there has to be a definition of what is normal sex or what is healthy. So yeah, I don't know how that really works.
Yeah, and there's that's right, and I think that there's a certain hard line in queer and feminist studies where any ascription to the normal gets our red flags going, and I think that normativity is like how you survive. Like you need to have norms to make to what you're gonna wear in the morning and how you're gonna conduct an interview. So my interests are not sort of anti-normativity writ large. It's well, what are we doing with sexual infractions and why, and what kind of sexual social world do we want the law and other venues to help us promote, and do sex offender registries help or hurt that vision? And it seems like they hurt it.
Right. So I wanted to talk in a little bit more detail also about this idea of consent, which, as you said, surfaces frequently in your writing and in your teaching. And I've noticed in the past few years, seemingly more than before to me, it's been quite the issue in the media with Penn State and Julian Assange. And I was wondering if you had an idea why this has become such a public idea now, as opposed to, say, 15 years ago.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's a great question. Well, first I'd say that it's also a big deal at Yale.
Yeah, that's for sure.
And it's kind of, and I don't mean this trivially, it's sort of exciting to be getting here when people are really thinking about consent and sexual misconduct and sexual violence in incredibly innovative ways. So one project I'd like to pursue is figuring out how my research and my class can interface with the communication and consent educators and other people and institutions that are thinking about sex equality and sexual misconduct and other similar issues at Yale. So that's great. Or there's something I look forward to. The now question. This is mostly speculative, but part of what my argument is in the dissertation is that I think we are at we, by we I mean, I don't know, certain demographics or certain whatever, are at a place where it's no longer like gays and lesbians is sort of no longer the sexual outside, and there's a good progressive population, the legal and social world where, you know, gay is great, or gay at least okay. And I think that means that a lot of the sexual stratification line falls on consent,
Right.
because we feel like that's not moralizing. That's where the line should be. We should think that all sexual life forms that exist on this side of consent are good and should be defended against and not discriminated, and those that fall on the bad side of consent
Right.
are bad, right? And so I think that there's a story to be told about the sort of the growing acceptability of sexual life forms that appear to fall under consent, and that you know, because you do see with at the same time that you see the legitimation of kind of nationwide legitimation of gay and lesbian life in like the mid-90s, you also see the rise of all of these re-emergence of contemporary sex offender
Right.
laws, which is not a causal argument, but it is
Somehow
interesting. It's a
related.
sort of interesting correlation to note.
Right.
You know, so.
So this is a little bit different, but I read some of what you wrote concerning sex panics, which is a term that I had never really encountered, but I guess I take to mean this sort of uprising socially, politically against a certain group, something they perceive as maybe a sex offense or just something wrong concerning a sex act. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more in depth the ways in which this is more of a concrete concept.
Okay, so the concept sex panic derives from the concept moral panic, and there were a whole bunch of British sociologists in the late 60s who were thinking about moral panic as a analytic to think about social problems, and I'm not going to give a whole lecture on it now because that'll be boring. But the basic idea that had different approaches to it was in times of social instability or social unrest, you'll see a heightened focus on a perceived problem, but that perceived problem might be a compensation point for larger problems or displacement, right? So that concerns over the Cold War, we might all be going crazy over prostitution or teen prostitutes or something like that, right? That's the argument, or concern over black teenagers in wherever might conceal a larger anxiety around unemployment and poverty and whatever, right? And so the sex panic stuff builds off of that, which kind of departed from the really specific formal, like there's lots of formal, almost dry work about moral panics and how they work and the relationship between media and the institution and the law and and the folk devil, this character you place all your anxieties on. And the sex panic literature side of kind of left that and just noticed that sexual non-normativity becomes a good catalyst for getting but also that the argument is that it would smuggle in regressive political agendas. So if you could get people alarmed about pornography or gayness or SM sex or whatever, you could push your policy agenda.
Kind of like filibustering with
sex. Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
I'm not a huge. I think it's sort of too heavy-handed.
Right.
Figuring out what exactly counts as panic and what counts as reasonable concern, and so I think it sort of has limited utility.
Right.
Yeah.
This is sort of another "can you define this for me" question, which is homo nationalism. My only point of reference is Judith Butler at the Berlin Gay Pride Parade giving a speech.
Okay.
But other than that, I'm not very familiar with things.
Okay, so I'm pretty positive that homo nationalism is a neologism, a word coined by Jasbir Puar in her book Terrorist Assemblages. And it too, like sex panic comes from moral panic, so homo nationalism ends up deriving from heteronormative, which is always a popular word across all liberal arts campuses, and heteronormative was, as far as I know, or that I remember correctly, was a word coined by Michael Warner, who's here, and Lauren Berlant in the early 90s. So these are all, it's kind of nice, funny to know that these are all really recent words that were born around the same time.
I didn't know that.
You were.
Yeah.
So heteronormative, well, we're not going to throw all the definitions. Homonationalism, I want to, in broad terms, I think is the idea that where gay acceptance, or what looks like gay normal, ends up in cahoots with or promoting imperial or nationalist objectives. So the example, would be posters with the advertising for. I'm thinking of a picture in Jazz McHugh's book of gay.com, where you have men, very very pretty white men, muscled men with an American flag draped around them, right? So that would be kind of the iconography of homonationalism, where it's gay images and lifestyles that purchase their political or social legitimacy by subscribing to American dominant interests or something, or patriotic.
That ended up being more related to sex panics than I thought it was going to be in terms of kind of presenting something as something else. It's also, I think, heavy-handed, and I'm writing an article currently where I critique the idea of homonationalism. So I should probably be more. I should have a clearer definition of what it is when someone asks me. But I think so. There's lots of there's lots of arguments that gay rights is used to promote nations' moral superiority. So Israel can say, "Oh, we like gay people," and by saying we like gay people, we mask the occupation. And our continued occupation in the Palestinian territories, and I just think I'm not sure I'd buy that. I think that you can. I'm not sure who they're fooling. I think you can both applaud Israel's gay rights record and still be very critical of the occupation. I'm not sure that one necessarily camouflages the other. Right. Look at our gay people, don't look over there.
Yeah, and you're kind of but they're still there, so what kind of magic trick is this? I think. But anyway, yeah.
All right. So my final question, you told me a little bit that you're trying to turn your dissertation, Sex and Harm in the Age of Consent, into a larger book. And I was wondering if you had any other plans for the future, whether here or kind of abroad.
Plans?
For research or for other, bigger projects.
Yeah, well, I would very much like to get involved with, in some way or another, with the various happenings around Yale on questions of sexual misconduct and consent and like that. I hear Sex Week is a big deal here, and I think that my research and work should contribute that in some way, while perfectly respecting the fact that I think it's really a student thing. So, but and I think IVQ is coming here in the winter, which is a queer student conference, which is awesome. It was at Brown last year where I was, and it was terrific. And I'd like to be able to help contribute to that. And as for me, I'd like to continue this New Orleans project and think about this question of crime against nature from different angle points, not just legal, not just about consent, but about the story of from an urban studies perspective, from the story of Katrina in New Orleans, and race relations in the South, and thinking about coming at this problem from different angles. So I think that's what's down the road.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thank you.